I thought my life was already broken when I became a delivery driver after my divorce. Then one morning, a mansion door opened and the elderly man staring back at me began to tremble. He said he'd been searching for my family since the war and pressed an old envelope into my hands. When I opened it, the air disappeared, and nothing was the same again. Before I take you there, do me a small favor, support this channel by subscribing and leaving a comment about where you're watching from, so stories like this don't disappear unnoticed. My name is Evan Carter, and I'm 39 years old. Not long ago, I was a regional operations manager for a construction supply company in Riverton, Ohio. I approved six-figure orders, oversaw multiple warehouses, and believed I'd built something permanent. I had a wife, Lauren, a daughter named Piper, and a two-story home in a quiet subdivision where lawns were trimmed and futures felt secure. Then my marriage ended. Lauren didn't leave because we fought constantly or because money was tight. She left because she wanted more excitement, more attention, more of a life that didn't come home tired. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday. By Friday, I was packing my clothes into cardboard boxes. By the following month, my job was eliminated during restructuring. Funny how companies decide you're replaceable right when your personal life falls apart. Within weeks, I went from signing contracts to scanning barcodes. From managing people to being managed by an algorithm that tracked every mile I drove and every minute I paused. I moved into a cramped apartment above my uncle's auto shop, waking every morning to the smell of oil and regret. I saw my daughter every other weekend and told myself this was temporary. But temporary has a way of stretching longer than you expect. My grandfather, Henry Carter, would have hated seeing me like that. He raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 8. He was a railroad man, solid, quiet, uncomplaining. A Korean War veteran who never talked about what he did overseas. He worked 40 years without missing a shift, his hands twisted with arthritis, his back bent, but his pride intact. Carter men don't quit, he used to say. We bend. We don't break. He died 16 years ago, leaving behind nothing but a small house, a shoebox of medals, and stories he only told when beer loosened his tongue. Even then, the stories were about the cold, the hunger, the boredom, never the fighting. The morning of October 18th began like every other delivery day. Alarm at 5:15 a.m. instant coffee because I couldn't justify the good stuff. Uniform that never fully lost yesterday's sweat. 42 packages assigned by software that didn't care about dignity. By mid-morning, my route sent me into Hawthorne Crest, a neighborhood where houses looked more like private museums. Iron gates. Stone facades. Driveways longer than my entire block. I hated delivering there. Every turn felt like a reminder of what I'd lost, and what my family had never had. The address that changed everything was 1962 Willowmere Lane. The name on the package meant nothing to me then, Harold Whitcomb. I pressed the intercom, announced myself, and watched the gates swing open smoothly, silently. The driveway curved through gardens maintained with obsessive precision. The house itself was perfect in a way that didn't feel warm, clean lines, tall windows, wealth without apology. I adjusted the package under my arm and walked up the steps, wiping my hands on my pants. I rang the bell. When the door opened, I expected staff. Instead, an elderly man stood there alone. He wore a soft gray cardigan over a crisp white shirt. His posture was straight despite his age, but the moment his eyes met mine, his entire body stiffened. Then he began to shake. Not the gentle tremor of old age, full-body shock, like someone had reached into his chest and pulled a memory straight to the surface. His hand shot out to grip the doorframe. Tears flooded his eyes. "You're a Carter," he said hoarsely. "You're Henry Carter's blood." My stomach dropped. "My grandfather?" I asked. "You knew him?" The man didn't answer right away. He just stared at my face like he was seeing someone he thought he'd lost forever. "You look exactly like him," he whispered. "The eyes. The jaw. Even the way you stand, shoulders back, but not rigid." I felt suddenly unsteady. "My name is Evan," I said carefully. "I'm here with a delivery." The package slipped from my hands and landed softly on the stone step. "I've been searching for your family for 70 years, the man said. 70 years. I shook my head. "Sir, I think you've made a mistake." "I've made many mistakes in my life," he said quietly. "This isn't one of them." He took a breath, steadying himself. "Please. Come inside. I don't have much time left, and I owe your grandfather a debt he never allowed me to pay." My phone buzzed in my pocket, an automated warning about idle time. The company tracked everything. "I can't stay," I said. "I'll get flagged." A faint smile crossed his face. "You won't." "How can you be sure?" "I own a significant stake in the company that signs your paychecks," he said. "I bought it years ago while I was searching for a man who didn't want to be found." That stopped me cold. Against every instinct about keeping my head down, I stepped inside. The house was magnificent, but I barely noticed. The man led me through a hallway lined with oil paintings and into a wood-paneled study that smelled of leather and old paper. He moved with urgency, not ceremony. He opened a hidden wall safe behind a painting. His hands trembled as he turned the dial, missing the combination once, then again. 70 years, he murmured. I promised I wouldn't stop looking. From the safe, he removed a yellowed envelope sealed with darkened red wax. I wrote this in 1953, he said, holding it like something fragile. Your grandfather refused it. What is it? I asked. A promise, he replied. And proof that doing the right thing doesn't always pay right away, but it never goes unpaid. He sat heavily in a leather chair and gestured for me to sit across from him. My name is Harold Whitcomb, he said. And your grandfather saved my life in Korea. The room felt smaller. He began to talk about a frozen hillside, about a 19-year-old private wounded under fire, about chaos and retreat and a staff sergeant who refused to leave a man behind. He spoke of bullets, blood, and snow, of being carried for miles while believing every step might be the last. That staff sergeant was my grandfather. He took 3 bullets getting me out, Harold said softly. Never dropped me. Never complained. Just kept telling me to stay awake. I swallowed hard. I tried to pay him, Harold continued. He refused. Said saving a life wasn't a transaction. He leaned forward, eyes wet. But some debts don't belong to the man who's owed them. They belong to the future. He placed the envelope in my hands. As I broke the wax seal, I had no idea that what I was about to read would explain my family's poverty, my grandfather's silence, and why a fortune meant for us had waited patiently for a carter to finally knock on the right door. My hands trembled as I unfolded the brittle pages inside the envelope. The paper smelled faintly of age and tobacco, like it had been waiting decades for the right moment to be touched again. The first document was typed, official-looking, stamped with seals that hadn't been used in generations. I read the opening line twice before it made sense. A trust established in January of 1953, in recognition of extraordinary service rendered during active combat. I looked up at Harold Whitcomb, convinced I was misunderstanding something. This can't be right, I said. My grandfather never mentioned anything like this. Of course he didn't, Harold replied quietly. That was who Henry Carter was. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on a place far beyond the walls of the study. When we were pulled off that hill, the medics said he shouldn't have survived. He'd lost too much blood. When I came to days later, I asked where he was. They told me he'd already been evacuated and sent back to his unit. He never came to see me. Never asked how I was. Just disappeared. Harold stood slowly and walked to a framed photograph on his desk. He picked it up and handed it to me. A black and white image of 2 young soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder. One was unmistakably my grandfather, strong jaw, steady eyes, expression calm even in uniform. The other was Harold, barely more than a boy. He saved me, Harold said. And then he let me go live the life he protected. I turned back to the papers. The trust's initial deposit was modest by today's standards, but enormous for its time. It was designed to sit untouched until claimed by Henry Carter or his direct descendants. Interest compounded annually. For 70 years. My mouth went dry. Why didn't anyone tell us? I asked. Harold smiled sadly. Because your grandfather refused it. When I tracked him down months after the war, working at a rail yard in Ohio, I brought the papers. I explained what they were worth. He handed them back to me and said, "Kid, you don't get paid for doing what's right. Go home to your family." My chest tightened. He walked away, Harold continued. For more money than most men ever see. Not because he didn't need it, but because he didn't want it. I thought about my childhood. The hand-me-down clothes. The leaky roof. The nights Henry sat at the kitchen table, rubbing his hands in pain, saying nothing. All that struggle. All that silence. How much? I asked, barely able to force the words out. Harold hesitated, then answered honestly. Just over $2 million. The room tilted. I gripped the arm of the chair, certain I'd misheard him. That's impossible, I said. I make $32,000 a year. I deliver packages. That doesn't disqualify you, he said gently. It explains you. I laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. My grandfather could have changed everything, I said. My parents wouldn't have struggled. My uncle wouldn't have worked himself into an early grave. I wouldn't be. I gestured helplessly at my uniform. He didn't take it because he believed his reward was that I lived, Harold said. But I believed his family deserved to live easier than they did. He pulled out another document. There's more. My heart sank and lifted at the same time. A separate policy, he said. Life insurance taken out by my father in 1955, with your grandfather listed as beneficiary. When we couldn't find him after his discharge, it was rolled into another trust. That one's been compounding for nearly 40 years. I didn't want to ask. How much? I whispered. About $800,000. I sat back, stunned. Over $3 million. Money that could have erased decades of anxiety, struggle, and quiet humiliation. Money my grandfather never wanted. I can't just accept this, I said. You don't even know me. Harold laughed softly. I know enough, he said. And my lawyers know the rest. He slid a thick folder across the desk, birth records, death certificates, military documents, everything tying me irrevocably to Henry Carter. You're not claiming something that isn't yours, he said. You're closing a chapter that's been open too long. I didn't cry. I couldn't. The emotion sat too deep, too heavy. 3 hours later, I stood outside the mansion, sunlight glinting off polished stone, holding verified paperwork that said my life was about to change. But the strangest thing wasn't the money. It was understanding. Understanding why my grandfather never complained. Why he never chased wealth. Why he believed dignity mattered more than comfort. I called my Uncle Raymond that night and told him everything. He didn't speak for a long time. Dad never said a word, he finally whispered. We lived our whole lives thinking we were unlucky. No, I said. We were protected. The transfer took 5 days. 5 days of disbelief. 5 days of waking up convinced it was a mistake. When the funds hit my account, I sat in my car and stared at the screen until my vision blurred. Lauren called 2 days later. Suddenly, she wanted to talk. Suddenly, she remembered what we'd built. I told her the only conversation we needed to have was about Piper's future, which was now secured beyond anything she could take. The silence on the line was complete. I didn't feel triumph. I felt peace. Because this wasn't about money catching up to a man who'd struggled. It was about honor finally finding its way home. And yet, something still felt unfinished. Because if my grandfather's story had been buried for 70 years, what else had been left behind? The money didn't arrive with fireworks. There was no dramatic notification, no swelling music, no moment where the universe paused to acknowledge that something massive had just shifted. 1 second my bank app showed numbers I was used to managing down to the last dollar. The next, there were commas I'd never seen attached to my name. I locked my phone and sat there in the driver's seat, engine off, delivery van idling, staring through the windshield at nothing. $3 million. It felt unreal, like a typo that would correct itself if I blinked too hard. But what weighed on me wasn't excitement. It was something colder. Heavier. Anger. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that simmers when you realize how different everything could have been, and why it wasn't. I thought about my grandfather, Henry Carter, coming home from the war with shrapnel still buried in his leg because he didn't trust doctors, working the rail yard with pain that would have crippled most men. I thought about my parents struggling before they died, my uncle scraping by, me telling my daughter, maybe next time, more times than I could count. All of it because one man believed accepting money would cheapen doing the right thing. I respected him for that. But I also wished, just once, he'd chosen differently. The following weeks moved fast. Too fast. Lawyers, accountants, financial planners. Words like fiduciary responsibility and asset diversification replaced conversations about overtime hours and gas prices. I learned how much of the world operates quietly behind closed doors, and how easily people treat you differently once they think you've crossed an invisible line. My delivery job ended politely. They said I'd outgrown the role. They weren't wrong. I didn't tell many people about the money. I didn't trust how quickly it changed the air in a room. But news has a way of traveling without your permission. My Uncle Raymond knew. Lauren knew. And eventually, people I'd never spoken to before somehow knew too. Letters arrived first. Then calls. Then visits. Old acquaintances. Distant relatives. Business ideas that all sounded urgent and essential. Everyone had a story. Everyone had a need. I said no to most of them. Not because I'd become stingy, but because I was starting to understand something my grandfather already had. Money doesn't reveal character. It amplifies it. I put most of the funds into protected accounts, trusts for Piper's education, and a modest home purchase that didn't scream wealth. I bought a small house with a porch and a yard big enough for a swing set. Nothing flashy. Nothing that needed guards or gates. Then I did something that surprised even me. I went back to Hawthorne Crest. Not to Harold Whitcomb's mansion. To the street just beyond it. There was a veterans housing complex there, low profile, underfunded, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. I'd driven past it dozens of times without noticing. Now I noticed everything. I met men who looked like my grandfather might have looked decades earlier, quiet, stiff-backed, hands scarred by labor. Men who never talked about what they'd done overseas. Men who thought needing help meant weakness. I listened. I didn't announce who I was or what I had. I just listened. And I realized something else. My grandfather wasn't unique. He wasn't the only man who'd walked away from recognition, money, or comfort because he believed duty didn't come with a receipt. Which meant his story wasn't just about us. It was about what had been lost, over and over again, because pride and silence had a cost no one ever calculated. That's when the idea took shape. Not as a plan. As a pull. I created a small foundation, not in my name, but in my grandfather's. The Henry Carter Legacy Fund. Its purpose was simple. To quietly support veterans and their families who'd slipped through the cracks because they'd never asked for help and never been offered it properly. No banners. No press releases. Just scholarships, medical support, housing assistance, and job placement for men and women who'd done their part and then been forgotten. I funded it modestly at first. Then more. Each time I signed a check, it felt like closing a circle that should have never been broken. Harold Whitcomb followed the progress closely. We spoke weekly. His health was failing, but his mind remained sharp. I never wanted the money to change who you are, he told me once. I wanted it to free you to choose who you already were. I understood that now. But something else still gnawed at me. A question I hadn't asked yet. Why now? I finally asked him during one call. You had decades. What made you open the door when you saw me? There was a pause. Because I'm running out of time, he said. And because your grandfather's story deserved to be told by someone who could still do something with it. That answer stayed with me. Because it wasn't just about money or legacy. It was about responsibility. And responsibility has a way of attracting resistance. The first sign of that came in the form of a letter from Lauren's attorney. She wanted to revisit the divorce settlement. Suddenly, the division of assets felt unfair to her. Suddenly, she believed the timing of my financial improvement warranted reconsideration. I read the letter twice. Then once more. Then I smiled. I forwarded it to my lawyer with a single line. Proceed. Lauren's tone changed quickly once she realized this wasn't a man scrambling to survive anymore. She wanted mediation. Then cooperation. Then closure. I agreed, to one thing only. Piper's future. Her college fund expanded. Her healthcare secured. Her opportunities widened. Everything else stayed exactly where it was. Lauren didn't fight after that. People like her rarely do when they realize control has shifted permanently. But not everyone backed off so easily. An investigative journalist reached out. Then another. Someone had traced the trust back to Harold Whitcomb. Someone else had noticed the foundation forming quietly under Henry Carter's name. Questions came. Requests for interviews. Offers to tell the story right. I declined them all. Because stories told too loudly invite the wrong kind of attention. And that attention arrived anyway. One evening, as I was locking up the foundation's small office, a man I didn't recognize stood across the street, watching. He didn't approach. Didn't speak. Just observed. The next week, it happened again. Different man. Same posture. I told myself I was being paranoid. Until Harold called me late one night. They found me, he said. Who did? People who don't like unfinished business, he replied quietly. People who believe debts should be forgotten, not paid. My grip tightened on the phone. What does that mean? It means, he said carefully, that my family has enemies I kept at bay for decades. And by closing this chapter, we may have reopened another. My stomach sank. Are you in danger? He chuckled weakly. I'm an old man with little left to lose. But you're visible now. The line went silent. And for the first time since the money arrived, I felt something shift. Not fear. Resolve. Because if my grandfather had taught me anything, without ever saying it, it was that when consequences come calling, you don't hide. You stand. And you finish what was started. Harold's warning didn't leave me. For days after that call, I moved through my routines with a heightened awareness, the way I used to on delivery routes when something felt off, when a street was too quiet, when a house had curtains drawn at noon. Except now it wasn't packages I was protecting. It was a truth that had been buried for 70 years and was finally surfacing. I increased security around the foundation office. Nothing flashy, just cameras, better lighting, and a private firm recommended by Harold's longtime attorney. I didn't tell Piper why I insisted on walking her to the car every morning or why I changed our routes home. I told her it was habit. She accepted that. Kids always do when they trust you. Harold's health declined quickly after that call. We spoke less often, but when we did, he sounded at peace. Lighter, almost. Like a man who'd been holding his breath for decades and was finally allowed to exhale. Whatever happens next, he told me during our last long conversation, promise me you won't let fear undo what honesty fixed. I promise, I said. And I meant it. The resistance didn't announce itself with threats. It came dressed as bureaucracy. The Foundation received notices questioning its compliance. Requests for audits that had no clear origin. A sudden review of zoning permits for our small office. Each issue alone was manageable. Together, they were pressure, subtle, relentless. My attorney traced the filings. They came through shell firms, each one legally clean, ethically questionable. Harold's enemies didn't need to break laws. They only needed to slow things down until people got tired. They underestimated one thing. I'd spent years being tired. This wasn't exhaustion. This was clarity. I leaned into transparency. Opened the books. Invited oversight. Published quarterly summaries of grants without names or fanfare. Quiet honesty is hard to attack without revealing your hand. That's when the call stopped. And the silence that followed was heavier than the noise. Harold passed away on a cold morning in early December. Peacefully, his son told me. In his sleep. No pain. I stood alone in my kitchen after the call, staring at the wall, feeling something close around my chest, not grief exactly, but completion. A circle closing. At the funeral, there were more people than I expected. Veterans. Doctors. Business leaders. Families who spoke his name with gratitude. When it was over, his son James pressed a sealed envelope into my hand. He wanted you to have this, he said. Inside was a simple note in Harold's neat handwriting. I kept my promise. Now you keep yours. No money. No instructions. Just trust. The pressure didn't return after that. Maybe the people watching decided it wasn't worth the effort anymore. Maybe they realized the story had legs and sunlight was dangerous. Or maybe Harold had done one last thing I never knew about. Either way, the Foundation continued. Piper grew. She laughed more easily. She stopped asking if money was something we'd lose again. Stability does that, it teaches kids to stop bracing. One afternoon, she asked me about her great-grandfather. Was he really brave, she asked. He was, I said. But not in the loud way. She thought about that. I like the quiet kind, she decided. So did I. Because that quiet bravery had carried a wounded teenager through snow and gunfire. It had carried a family through decades of struggle without bitterness. And now it was carrying us forward, steady, unannounced, unbroken. I understood then that the money wasn't the miracle. The miracle was time finally catching up to truth. And the choice to do something good with it before it slipped away again. Time didn't rush back into place after Harold Whitcomb's funeral. It settled slowly, like dust after a long collapse. The Foundation continued its quiet work. Grants went out. Homes were repaired. Medical bills disappeared from kitchen tables without explanation. Veterans who had never asked for help received it without being made to feel small. That was how I wanted it. No banners. No speeches. No reminders that generosity had a source. I kept my promise to Harold by refusing to turn his debt into spectacle. The last of the pressure faded completely by spring. The shell audits dissolved. The zoning issues were quietly withdrawn. Whoever had been watching decided the cost of interference outweighed the benefit. Sunlight has that effect, it forces shadows to move. Life grew steadier. Piper started middle school and asked fewer questions about money. She joined the debate team. Learned how to argue without raising her voice. Sometimes I saw my grandfather in her, calm, stubborn, quietly certain of what mattered. My relationship with Lauren settled into something distant but functional. She never mentioned the money again. She didn't need to. Control had shifted in a way no document could undo. One afternoon, months after the funeral, I found myself back at the old rail yard where Henry Carter had worked for most of his life. The buildings were abandoned now, rusted and hollow, but the tracks remained. I stood there listening to the wind move through steel and thought about a man who carried a wounded teenager through snow without expecting anything in return. He never saw himself as a hero. He saw himself as a man doing what needed to be done. That understanding changed how I saw success. I stopped measuring it by numbers and started measuring it by impact. The Foundation expanded slowly, intentionally. We partnered with small clinics, trade schools, counseling programs that understood trauma without advertising it. I hired veterans first, not because of symbolism, but because they understood duty without needing to be reminded. Every year on October 18th, I visited Harold's grave and my grandfather's, standing between two men connected by a frozen hillside and a promise that waited 70 years to be honored. I never told Piper the full story until she was older. When I finally did, she didn't focus on the money. She focused on the choice. He could have taken it, she said. And he didn't. Yes, I replied. And you could have kept it all, she added. And you didn't. I smiled. That was the inheritance worth protecting. Some legacies are loud. Others are carried quietly through time, waiting for the right moment, and the right person, to finish what was started. If my story stayed with you, if it reminded you that integrity often goes unseen and unpaid until much later, take a moment now to support this channel. Subscribe, share my story with someone who believes quiet courage still matters, and leave a comment about where you're watching from. Stories like this survive only when they're passed forward.